Welcome back, everyone. Today we are on Lesson 10, Chapter 10, Understanding the CSS Box Model and Positioning. What we're going to learn in this lesson today is how to conceptualize the CSS box model. We're going to learn how to change the box model the browser uses. We're going to learn how to position elements. We're going to learn how to control the way elements stack up. And we're going to learn how to manage the flow of text. In the previous lesson, we did talk about the CSS box model a few times, but we want to go in a little bit more detail in this lesson so we understand really everything that's going on there. In your book, in the beginning of Chapter 10, it shows you this CSS box model. It shows where it has the content in the center, surrounded by padding, surrounded by border, and then on the outside of that is margin. This is important because every element in HTML is represented by the CSS box model. That's why your book talks about it. I put it in your PowerPoint presentation, and I'm going to talk about it now. Every element you make in HTML, whether you see it or not, or you style it or not, it's going to have this border around it. You can see the border if you actually add styling and make it black and set the thickness, or make it any color. And sometimes when I'm styling elements and I want to see how big or the actual space on the page, if I'm just adding some text on a page, I'll add some CSS to it and just add the border so I can see what happens when I add padding or add some margins, or just when I manipulate the size of that, how far that border is actually extending. And it's also helpful to use your developer tools that we talked about when we were learning JavaScript. Because if you inspect your element in the browser, such as Chrome or Firefox, and you look at that, you can actually highlight over each area, and it will show you the CSS box model in the bottom there when you're looking at the styles. You can see where the content is and how the padding is affecting it, and where the border is and how big the element is. It's also useful because even if you didn't actually add that border, so you can see that we know that imaginary border is there, when you're using your developer tools, you can actually see it highlights over the whole element. So that's kind of important to use. It goes over in your book a little bit about changing the box model should you need to. And then it talks about positioning. When we think of positioning, we're talking about the position property in CSS, which can have different values such as relative, absolute, fixed, or static. Relative positioning is positioned relative to its current position in the document flow. Absolute means it's positioned based on its container element. Fixed is its position relative to the browser window. And static, it means it's placed as it appears in the normal flow, and this is default. There's also another value called sticky, which causes elements to toggle between relative and fixed depending on the scroll position. It is relative until a scrolling offset position is reached, and then it is fixed. You should use this with the WebKit browser prefix position WebKit sticky for widespread support. If you've ever seen a header on a web page, then when you scroll down, the header stays with you. So when you scroll down to a certain point and you would have normally passed through and not see the nav or header anymore, but then you reach a point where it stays with you. That's called a sticky header or a sticky nav bar. You'll see that a lot. A lot of people like to keep their navigation up top, set it to sticky so it stays no matter how far down to the bottom you scroll. And then in the previous lesson, we saw how to use float, which determines how text flows around an element. And I think we did talk about clear, which stops the flow of text around an element. We're going to talk about overflow, the overflow style property, which controls overflow of text when an element is too small to contain all the text. So if we're using overflow, it handles overflow text just like what it sounds, which is text that doesn't fit within its rectangular area. This can happen if you set width and height properties of an element too small. The overflow property can set to visible, hidden, or scroll. The visible setting automatically enlarges the element so that overflow text fits within it. Hidden value leaves the element the same size, allowing overflow text to remain hidden from view. So you're going to lose some of your text, but it won't change the size of the document. And then the most, probably the one I use, or the most common one, is scroll, which adds scroll bars to the element so that you can move around and see the text. If you're making a blog site, if you're making a website, and you're going to have users comment in a certain area, or write a blog, or you're going to write some type of template for something, and someone puts more text than is in that space for that area, setting an overflow property to scroll will just add a scroll bar so users can see all your content. What you really don't want to do is have non-visible content when it's supposed to be. So I rarely use the overflow property and set it to hide. You don't want to hide certain text. And sometimes if you set it to visible, it expands and it kind of messes up the positioning on the page, and it could push other elements farther, and it could behave in a way that you don't want it to behave. So this is how the overflow property can be set: visible, hidden, or scroll. And it's just important to understand how that works. Coming up next, I'm going to share my screen with you and show you some examples of what. So this is an example using relative positioning. It's similar to the example in your book in that there are 4 divs, but instead of using color background squares, I placed images, so you can see how to add an image there. Notice that we're styling all these divs with position relative and setting the height and width, and adding a 2-pixel solid border of black around so we can see what's happening. So in your book it has the red, blue, green, and yellow divs. I just changed it to images. So if you're following along in your book, it's fairly similar. So in the browser, this will look like this. This is relative positioning. Notice how those stacked right under each other on the left. We could take away that border. And it would just show without the border. Notice that your book was styling each one with a background color. I commented that out because we don't need a background color because we are using images. So that's why that used to be there and it's not there anymore. Absolute positioning. So similarly here, the HTML has 4 divs, each with an image in there. Up here, we're using absolute positioning, same height and width. We don't need this because there's going to be no text in there. We have a 5-pixel black border, so that would be a little thicker. And then in each of these divs, we're setting the position. So we're using absolute positioning. So from the left, the first one's going to be 0 pixels. From the top, it's going to be 0 pixels. This one's going to be 225 pixels from the left and 75 pixels down from the top. So let's save this and load this and see what this looks like. This one, notice this one was 0 and 0. This is 25 pixels from the top. This is 75 pixels from the top. This one, 225. So it works from the top left corner, and you can go left and top. And you can position these on the page anywhere. Notice how we're using absolute positioning. This is their absolute position, and this is where they're going to be. I'll go back to the code so you can see. Now using the z-index. So we saw how we had these. What if we wanted this one or this one to show up on top? See how by default this last one is on top of everything and this one's all the way on the bottom? Well, we talked about how we can use the z-index for that. So we're still going to use absolute positioning. And like I said, we don't actually need these. Your book had the background colors. I removed them because I added images, like I said in the previous examples. This is almost the exact same for this previous one, but instead, down here, I added a z-index in each of the divs. So if you notice, the first one has a z-index of 0, the second one has a z-index of 3, and then 2, and then 1. So this one, div 2, has the highest z-index, so it's going to be on top. And then this one next, and this one's going to be all the way on the bottom because it has a z-index of 0. So let's see what this looks like in the browser. Okay, remember this one had a z-index of 3, highest one, and this one's on top. This one had a z-index of 2, so that's next, a z-index of 1, and then a z-index of 0. So notice how the difference with no z-index, and like I said, the border you can remove. No z-index, this is how they are default. And then when you add the z-index, you can control which one stacks on top of each other. That is an example of using the z-index property to stack your elements on the page. Once again, here's that code. We're just adding the z-index. Coming up next, we have our PowerPoint presentation for Lesson 10, Chapter 10. So stay tuned.